there's very few people left that ever remember 3 steam engines from different railroads coming in to Harrisonville. And as a young guy, why, I recall when the Missouri Pacific, which was from Pleasant Hill through Harrisonville south, and I recall the Katy from Paola, Kansas, over to through East Lynn, Gunn City, and Holden. And I also recall a Frisco that came down from Belton through Peculiar and through Harrisonville. The first railroad in Cass County was in 1865 at Pleasant Hill, and the townships were asked to put bonds forward to help pay for railroads. We had several townships that done that, and we had some also, 1 or 2, if I remember correctly, that were county bond issues. Part of the bond issues went south, did not work out as planned. Most of the old timers of Cass County have heard and read about the Gunn City Massacre that happened in 1872.
We're on the front side of the Cass County Courthouse at the southwest corner of it, and we're showing the United We Stand, Divided We Fall tablet here that has the inscription of the Cass County judges who suffered imprisonment by the U.S. federal court rather than make a tax levy to pay fraudulent company and township railroad bonds. The men that was in prison was F.E. Johnson and W.P. Barnes from September 1 of 1883 to January 1 of 1884. The other 3 men was W.A. Ray, F.M. George, and E.T. Lane, and they were in prison from March 21st of 1892 to January 1 of 1893. This inscription, made by order of the Cass County Court on September the 9th, 1897, in compliance with the petition presented by J.N. Haddock. This and the inscription on the front of the building, which says, "A public office is a public trust," was inspired by the railroad bond incident at Gunn City, Missouri. 3 men of Harrisonville was involved in what we now call, and then called, the Gunn City Massacre. A county judge by the name of J.R. Stevenson, an attorney by the name of Klein, and the mayor pro tem, who was a councilman here in Harrisonville by the name of Detro, was involved in that.
That story went that they was on the way to Holden, Missouri by way of the Katy Railroad track, Katy Railroad, over to Holden to get on the Missouri Pacific to go to Kansas City.
The 24th day of this April, about 4:50 in the afternoon, and got on the Katy Railroad train and went to Gunn City. Their idea was make it over to Holden to catch the Missouri Pacific train going to Kansas City. When the train got to East Lynn, there was 2 men got on it. And Klein, Stevenson, and Detro suspicioned something. So they asked the conductor if they could get in the baggage car. The conductor allowed that. As they pulled into Gunn City, why, those 2 men abandoned the passenger car, got on top, and started applying the brakes. There was about 52 fellas in an old blacksmith shop building, and they had barricaded the rail. The engineer stopped the train, and that's when the gunfight started. Anyhow, Stevenson and Klein was killed immediately. Detro was severely wounded and died a few hours later.
Those men were brought into Harrisonville, and a trial was had, and they didn't know who bullets might have hit the men, so they were all acquitted.
The history book that is most prominent and most respected of the incident of the bond issue is the history book that is the history and directory of Cass County. It was articles from the 1908 Cass County Leader newspaper. Now, the reporter that wrote the story on that is probably the most respected story of facts of that incident. And it starts on about page 180 in this book, and it goes all the way over to about page 200. And if you really want to know the details about how that all came about, it is the most interesting story. Would suggest that you go to the Historical Society, either read the story there or purchase the book. It is available.
Most interesting part for the Harrisonville side of it for me was the guy by the name of Detro that was in that massacre. And he had bought a partial of ground in the north end of town, and he had platted it, and the plat is recorded, and it's in today's plat book, which I happen to have an 1895 plat book here, and I think it's on page 34 and 35. The subdivision that he platted looked like probably was as much as 40 acres, and it is called Detro's Addition. In that addition is the Missouri Pacific railroad track, which today is Union Pacific. But at that time, he laid out Grand Avenue, which was 100 foot wide, if my memory serves me correctly, and that is where that railroad track is. Most people in this community don't know that we got a Grand Avenue. There's not a street sign on it or anything. It's just the railroad right away. As a young guy, I remember unloading boxcars of lumber off of that railroad.
Well, and we're on the intersection of what the plat book calls Grand Avenue and North Independence Street, where Independence blends into Locust Street. This is the Missouri Pacific line. Today is known as the Union Pacific, and it is sublet to Missouri Northern Arkansas folks who do the local trains here. The local train transportation in this town right now is about as strong as I've ever seen it in my lifetime. We have grain loading station, we have Universal Forest Products, we have ADS, and we have the Church and Dwight factory that brings in soda ash in order to make oxidol. Grand Avenue was platted in about 1869-70 by a fellow by the name of Detro. Detro is one of the men that was involved in the crooked bond issue and was murdered in the Gunn City Massacre. Grand Avenue here is 100 foot wide, and when he purchased this ground and platted it, he had in mind of trying to bring a railroad down through here. And consequently it did. Now the depot that was here was across the tracks right here in front of us. The mail came this way and all of the freight into town. This was a busy depot for the simple reason it came from, a lot of the freight came from the eastern part of the United States through St. Louis, then on the Missouri Pacific track all the way to Pleasant Hill, then switched over to this track and brought into Harrisonville. I recall seeing coal cars parked on a siding here and men unloading those coal cars by hand into coal bins. A coal company owned by a man by the name of Welburn and a coal company owned by the name of Millington. Here to the east, when we look down the track, we see the cross arm of Lexington Street. At that cross arm, the Katy Railroad track crossed the Missouri Pacific going to East Lynn. I don't recall the exact date, but it was in the 40s, right after they had started putting diesel engines on the track. A steamer with a tender on behind it decided that he could outrun the diesel engine, and he pulled out and got on the track, and the diesel engine run into it and shot off and just missed the house that you see on the other side of the cross arms down there where the big cedar tree is. I think that happened in about 1947, shortly after the end of World War II. And then about 10 years ago, right here on this track, a southbound coal train that no doubt had loaded up in Gillette, Wyoming, was on the way transporting I think they run 126 coal cars on those trains. Usually they had 2 or 3 engines and a pusher engine on it. And somehow or another, that train left the tracks here, spilled coal all along and blocked the highway. And after that incident, they replaced the rails. So these rails that you see here replaced those rails after the train wreck.
This is a blown up picture of the 4 railroads that came through. Only one went down Grand Avenue. The other 3 outskirted it to the north. I recall all 4 depots was in town. 3 of them were in the north end of town, and the Kansas City Clinton Springfield Railroad depot is where now the Walgreens drugstore's at. That depot, of course, they were storage tanks for fuel. The fuel was brought in by tank cars on the railroad and transferred into the storage tanks. Those storage tanks, several of them were where Dollar General store is on Commercial Street now. There was 3 different oil companies that had storage tanks along here.
We're at what used to be the right-of-way of the old Kansas City Clinton Springfield Railroad, jokingly known as the Leaky Roof Railroad. When I was a lad 8 decades ago, the depot was right in this area between where we're sitting and Commercial Street. And at that time, the railroad had been removed. It was removed in 1835. Of course, don't remember the depot, but I remember the warehouse that was with the depot where they unloaded freight at, and that was used by a fellow by the name of D. Yoder for his Skelly fuel distribution center. You have to keep in mind, fuel was brought into Harrisonville in tank cars by the railroads. And on this railroad, there was about 4 different fuel distribution points. The Skelly was here between Washington and Mechanic, and Mobile and Standard, and St. Clair was between Mechanic Street and Wall Street. Most all of that, of course, those fuel had to be transferred from the tank cars into tanks high off the ground so they'd gravity flow into truck fuel distribution tanks, and then they would take it out to the fueling stations, the filling stations, and out to the farmers. Got to keep in mind that in those early days, a lot of tractors burnt kerosene, and they would start on gasoline and run on kerosene. So kerosene was a big thing for the farmers in the early days. When I was a lad, right behind the camera here was the Armstrong's elevator. And during World War II, the feed companies would bag their feed up in print cotton bag, and then the bags would be used to make into clothing. I recall during World War II that I wore several shirts that was made out of feed sacks. My mother made dresses for herself, and it was not uncommon to see women on the square shopping, and they would have on a dress with the same feed sack print. 1835, 7 Highway was built from the intersection on what we know now as 7 Highway, but at that time it was 35 Highway. The railroad had permission to remove the tracks, but somehow or another they left the tracks in until they could bring the material in to pour the concrete for 7 Highway going to Clinton. And then they removed the tracks in 35. A real story behind that, a lengthy story. Raymond Holly's father was one of the men that helped remove those tracks. Someday we'll need to interview Raymond and get the facts on that. To the north of us is a couple of sheds on the north side of Wall Street. One of them is on the west side of the right-of-way. One of them is on the east side of the right-of-way. The one on the west was a feed store that was built right after the war by the Berge brothers. And that building is in very disrepair right now and is not being occupied. The one on the east side is a concrete block building. It was used for fertilizer, and I understand that the owner is using it for storage now. On the other side of that is the Oakland Cemetery. The Oakland Cemetery had some problems in life. I don't know that we've ever really been able to find the true records of how big the Oakland Cemetery was when it was established, when the town was established in 1837. But in 1918, 1919, and 1920 is when the 71 Highway was constructed through Harrisonville. And the date is still on the bridges here just to the north of us on what is now Commercial Street. The highway selected that particular site because there's 4 railroads coming into Harrisonville, and they could build underpasses under 3 of them and run along beside the 4th one, which the 4th one was the leaky roof. And I don't recall all of the details, but the drainage of that underpass has been a fascination to me most of my life. That was an engineering drainage feat that I really don't understand, but it works. So we got several things we can show you over at the Oakland Cemetery. There is a retaining wall that the railroad built through the cemetery when it went through. And then, of course, when the highway came through in the late teens, came through the cemetery and they had to move graves. My uncle, who was in his 20s in that time, said that there was a lot of discussion in Harrisonville of the fact that 71 Highway was doing away with the Jefferson Highway, which went across the west side of the square, and also the fact that they had to move graves, and said that was a lot of discussion went on in the community about the fact they had to move the dead, and the fact that the businesses would be located down on the highway and would kill the square. So, okay, we are on the right-of-way of the Kansas City, Clinton, Springfield Railroad at the junction of the Missouri Pacific Rail. And the reason we're at the north side of the west side of the east side of the Oakland Cemetery, and we want to show you this retaining wall that was laid in here by railroad people when they built the right-of-way over 130, 40 years ago. How big the stone were, how no doubt it took strong men to place them and get that in there. They didn't have many track hoes in those days. Everything had to be brought in by horsepower, and consequently, and I just got a tick off of my neck. Consequently, it was a lot of hard manual labor. Now, when the leaky roof came through, if I remember my history correctly, it was the last rail that came into Harrisonville, and it had to cross over 3 railroad tracks. the Frisco, the Katy, and what we know today as the Missouri Pacific. And today it's a Union Pacific track leased to the Missouri Northern Arkansas Rail Company. Anyhow, had to be an engineering feat of crossing 3 railroad tracks. I have no idea how that switching would have worked, but no doubt was a complicated thing. And we got concrete signal markers still in the ground from those railroads. They just cut the post off at the top of the ground and let the concrete in the right-of-ways. There was so many railroads in Harrisonville that this railroad was the least profitable. Had it not been for the Dickey Clay people at Deepwater, Missouri, making brick and vitreous clay tile, why the railroad wouldn't have lasted as long as it did. And then when the Depression hit, why there was no demand for brick and vitreous tile, and consequently Dickey ended up closing that plant down. And the railroad didn't have a profit then, so the decision was made to take it out, and it was dismantled in 1935. Progress is always talked about. I can recall on the other side of Mechanic Street here where we're at, with a feed mill called Economy Feed Mills. A man by the name of Fred Thomas had came into Harrisonville and had bought that facility, and the ice making plant was next door to it. Now the ice making plant was an ammonia type plant that they chilled the water with to freeze the ice. And it was within about 25 feet of this railroad, and they could elevate the ice into the high part of the building and put it on a chute and shoot it across the driveway and drop it into refrigerator cars. I don't remember seeing that done, but I remember that ramp was still there when in my youth. Sat here and we're across from the Harrisonville Marketplace, and of course in my youth that was pasture ground, and down here where the Blush physical therapy or whatever it is, that was original potty pond for the city of Harrisonville. When the sewer system was put in, they located it here, and then it was moved to its present location later on. I also remember 3 different train wrecks that happened in this town, and all 3 of them were on the Missouri Pacific track. One of them was in the 40s when a steam engine pulled off of a siding onto the main track, and it was one of the first diesel electric engines that had been put on. Behind me, this building that Bill Shelton owns is the original depot for the Katy Railroad. The Katy went within about a mile of the farm that I grew up on out west of Harrisonville. And there was a cattle loading area on the south side of the track. It was called Purdyman Spur. As a young lad, I remember seeing that train stop there with a cattle car and load up stuff. I do not recall the last date that the train ran, but I think it was in the mid-50s. And then later on, the right-of-way was abandoned, the rails were taken up, the bridges taken down, and the ties taken up. Anyhow, we lost the right-of-way. Part of that right-of-way is in the local park system and is part of the foot trails that we have in our local park system. The late 70s, early 80s, there was a northbound train that come into town traveling too fast. The serpentine track that crosses over what we know as Commercial Street at the time was 71 US 71 highway, built in 1920. I think the date on one of those bridges is still there. So every time you drive under that structural hot riveted steel bridge, well, you can
thinking you mind that that bridge is over 100 years old.
We're on North Independence Street at the intersection of Vine and Independence on the north side of Vine Street, where the Frisco Railroad Depot sat. We show a rail of the switch that was never removed, still here. And this is where the switch behind the railroad depot, and the water tower was across the road about where the camper vehicle is, and they could fill up the water on the steam engine either when it was on the main track or whether it was over on the switch track. The main track was down here. The depot, probably the outline of the dead grass here is about where the depot was on the south edge of it, and then the front edge of it was over here, and the main track is about where the asphalt was. And it went right around where those buildings are, and if the sign wasn't so faded out, it would say
Trackside Store.
when the railroad was abandoned, why, of course, the right-of-way was divided down the middle and the people claimed it. So the fence on the south side of the storage unit is the center line of the spur that went on the back side of the depot. There's a lot of history right here in this particular part because the first electric generating plant was across the street and back about 150 feet, and then a grain elevator and mill was here where the precast storm shelter is. It was a 3-story building, and it was right beside the railroad, so they could transfer grain either from the cars or from the mill into a car. In the winter of 53-54, when I first was out of high school and was working at the local lumberyard, a building was being built on Wall Street for a medical center. The floor joist in that was 2x12s, 24 foot long. They came in on a railroad car on the Missouri Pacific line, and we could only haul 12 of them on the back of the old truck. The truck bed was 14 feet. Any more than that, we cantilevered it so much that it'd take the front steering wheels off of the pavement. The first time we came up here, we went to go over the hump of the railroad right here, and the front end of the truck came up off the ground. We had to back up to Ash Street, turn around, and we backed all the way around the square to Wall Street in order to haul those 24-foot 2x12s. Anyhow, we done that for about 12, 14 trips. 1954 was one of the driest seasons that we had here in Cass County, even including the seasons of the Depression and the Dust Bowl. I recall that my father and I took hay out of a boxcar here to take back to our farm for the cattle. Right here in the low spot down here by the telephone pole and where the telephone, the light pole and where the telephone riser is, was the first city water works. That was the pumping station that they pumped the water from Lake Luna into the water tower that stood in the 200 block of West Pearl Street. Lake Luna, if my memory serves me correctly, was constructed in 1907, and today it's in the process of being rebuilt, which would make it about 115 years when the first fill was put in. And they're over there putting in a new spillway right as we speak. The Harrisonville Water Works was a private-owned company along with the Harrisonville. The electric power that was in here was a private-owned company, and before the city of Harrisonville bought that, and when they did, why, they started generating power from natural gas in this building here. I recall seeing 5 generators in that part of the building, and then this part over here had a big 12-cylinder generator in it for a while. And this building was, this part of the building was a water treatment plant, and the clear well for that treatment plant is still under the ground there and still has water in it on the other side of the pickup. That was the clear well when they was treating the plant. So there's a lot of history right here, touched a lot of lives. When I worked at the post office, I recall that we brought mail down here to go on the train to go to Kansas City. And we also took mail to the Missouri Pacific Railroad. It's been a pleasure to visit with you guys on this. I hope you can put together something that's worthwhile. Thank you very much. Appreciate you. Okay, guys, tell me what you thought.